All right, so before we get started here, um, that Canvas discussion, number four, so that was due at the end of the day yesterday, as well as that kind of fifth quiz. So you should be able to review that fifth quiz, the answers now. We've got one more Canvas discussion due by the end of the day on Thursday. Make sure you're getting these kind of daily quizzes done. We have one more, which is due at the beginning of class tomorrow that we covered yesterday. And we're actually going to dive back into this. We didn't have time for question two. So I'm going to go through that, mention some things about it. You've got that set of practice problems for quiz six. That's also due by the end of the day on Thursday. So start making sure you're kind of studying for that, using the practice problems, getting that done early. Once again, I think it's only 12 questions, so a little bit smaller than the other quizzes. Once you complete that, you should be able to view which ones you got correct, which ones you got incorrect. For the ones you got incorrect, you can start to kind of rework those. If you have any questions on those, you can reach out or ask questions on those today or tomorrow. I can't be maybe as specific in going through those exact questions, but I can go through ones that are similar. And other than that, that should kind of bring us to the end of this summer semester, and we have that final exam on Friday. So once again, there's an announcement up there. I'll probably post a standalone announcement later today about the final, but it is going to be using the honor lock system. So once again, we have kind of that test due before we start class tomorrow. If you complete that honor lock kind of extra credit, that's worth 3 percentage points. I kind of mentioned that it's going to score it incorrect or correct based on your response, but I'll give everybody credit. As long as you submit answers to this, you'll get that full 3 points. Okay. Other than that, so that final is going to be open from I think I said 9:30 to 3:30 because of kind of the start time of my second section. And just to give a little bit more time, I'll be in the office at 9. I'll actually open it up to be 9 to 4. So just a little bit more time. Once you start that exam, you have 2 hours to complete it. Um, Scratch paper, kind of handwritten notes are allowed. You should have a calculator to use, and you cannot open any other web browser or program on your computer or device once you start taking that. Okay. Any questions before me not related to concepts or not looking at practice problems before we get started here? Okay. So there's really only two slides we didn't get through yesterday on Module 12. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to ask you questions on this purchasing power parity. It is kind of interesting. I don't think it's valuable for us to kind of work through this. We'll save some time for the, review that we can be doing today. But one thing that I do want to go through that would be expected on the exam and on that quiz, and this is where actually I wanted to mention something about quiz six. If you got on and took it early, because we didn't cover this, I hadn't really thought about that. And if you got, I believe it was the first part of question 11 wrong, I'm going to just give everybody credit for that since we hadn't quite reviewed that material. So we'll walk through it today, kind of look at how we would solve one of those questions. Um, but I just wanted to mention that about that quiz question. Let's see, we got something in the chat. So the calculator. Be on the testing. Yeah, if you don't have a physical calculator, there's one that'll be you can pull open on the honor lock system as well. It's a good question. Okay. So let's take a look at kind of these exchange rates and think about the inflation on real exchange rates. So everything up to this point, we've actually, and I didn't maybe necessarily specifically say this, but we're going to introduce this idea today. So when we're talking about that exchange rate in our graphs is the nominal exchange rate. So we haven't really adjusted for prices yet. So you can imagine just because a currency, like let's say the US dollar can get 5 euros, well, that's kind of irrelevant if prices in that country are significantly lower, right, than the US. And so what we want to do is we want to adjust these nominal exchange rates. And here I said we'll kind of always think about this from the US standpoint, right? We're looking at the US kind of international money market. So to adjust for prices, we're going to take the domestic price. Here we're just looking at the US. and divide it by whatever that foreign price is. Okay. This is going to adjust our exchange rates, right? Meaning that even if the exchange rate is higher, right? If we can get more euros, well, if everything's more expensive, that's in Europe, that's not necessarily really, that's, money's not going to go as far. And so we can think about a very basic question. I would give you the exchange rate in nominal terms. I'd tell you the price levels in that country. So maybe this is something like three prices here would be, I don't know, 60 and then kind of 40. So it'd just be a matter of plugging these values in to determine what your real exchange rate was. Now, a different variant of this question, maybe I ask you what the nominal exchange rate is, and I give you that real exchange rate. Still one equation, you're just solving for the one thing that you don't know. Okay. So those hopefully will be easier questions on the exam in terms of just calculating that real exchange rate. However, we want to think about what's going to cause that real exchange rate to change. Well, the first thing, I think it's not too much of a stress, but if nominal exchange rates go up, well, that's going to cause my real exchange rate to go up as well. Now, the second thing we could think about is what if instead I had an increase in the prices of the US? Right? Well, increases in the prices of the US, right, would mean that the same number of dollars in foreign currency won't be able to buy as much. And so that's going to kind of influence our real exchange rate. So if we have increases in the domestic currency, we're also going to see that real exchange rate increases. Right? Now, a third thing is going to be if that exchange rate stays the same, right? But prices here we can think about, let's say prices go down in foreign countries. So I've got the same amount of that foreign currency based off what the exchange rate is, but now my money kind of goes further, right? I can buy more products because that price in the foreign market is lower. So if we had a decrease in the prices of the foreign currency, dividing by a smaller value increases this fraction and increases our real exchange rate, right? Because essentially it's like the same US dollar, even though we were only getting 5 euros, those euros are worth more, right? So we're essentially getting like more euros per every single kind of US dollar. So that would also cause our real exchange rate to increase. So I might ask you to calculate it, but then a subsequent question might be if one of these things changes, what's that going to do to real exchange rates? Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So the next thing we'll do before we kind of open this up for questions is let's look at that daily quiz from yesterday. And I gave you the answers here. If you're looking at that quiz, if you submitted it, I updated this a little bit just to give you something more like you might see on the quiz or exam. So we're going to work through this. We've got the answers here, but maybe just to work through this like it's an actual question. Let's say we don't know. So we're going to have one change here, which is that the productivity in the US increases. What's that going to do to the exchange rate for the US dollar? And then what is that impact going to have on whether or not we have an inflation or deflationary gap? And then how should the government kind of resolve that? So we're really tying two concepts here. We're taking the international market and then connecting it to the US, the market for their overall economy, kind of what prices and real GDP are. Okay. So with this setup in mind, we're going to start out and we thought about there is a change in the productivity of the US, right? So here I'm, in theory, this could actually cause multiple changes here, right? But I'm just asking you for what that change will do to exchange rates, right? So we're just focusing on one effect of that productivity increase. So we said we've got the quantity of US dollars, we've got the exchange rate, and there's going to be some supply of the US dollar, some demand for the US dollar in these international markets. Here's our initial exchange rate. So we said if productivity increases in the US, it's essentially like using all of our same resources, we can now produce more, right? Or essentially we can produce the same number of products, but at a lower cost. So what that is going to result in is prices in the US are going to fall, right? Firms won't require as high of a price as before because they're producing these units at a lower cost. So what is that going to do? Right? Well, if prices go down in the US, is it more or less attractive for foreign countries to buy US products or hold US dollars? Well, if they're cheaper, demand from those foreign countries for the US dollar, so we can think about the demand for the US dollar is actually going to increase. Right? So if the demand for the US dollar increases, what does that do to our equilibrium exchange rate? It would increase it. Okay? So the first thing is we can kind of think about we're going to see an increase in that exchange rate for the US dollar. What is that impact then on the overall economy? So this is where we start to get what I would call like cascading effects. So we first identified what that change in productivity did in the international markets. We're now going to think about how does this impact the economy in the US. Okay. So we've got our initial kind of standpoint and all of the questions that I had like this, I always start out the actual terminology I'll use. I'm telling you what it will look like on the exam. You might think about it if I have no gap, short and long run GDP are the same. Another way of saying that is that whatever the current GDP is, that's like my short run GDP. It's the same as potential GDP or what our GDP would be in the long run. So I'll kind of phrase it this way where I tell you that assume the current and potential GDP are the same. That's another way of saying the short and long run GDP are the same, or we have no gap. Right? If we see this demand for currency go up, what did that do to our exchange rate? Well, it increased it, right? So if we see an increase in the exchange rate for the US dollar, we said, does the dollar have more or less value? So we would say it has more value or it's appreciating, right? A higher exchange rate means I'm getting more of the foreign currency for the same US dollar. So if the US dollar has more value, are we going to buy more or fewer kind of foreign products? We're actually going to increase the number of foreign products we buy, or imports would go up. Okay. Now, anytime we see exchange rates for the US dollar increase, that's always matched by, well, if the US dollar has more value or appreciating, you can kind of think about the exchange rate for foreign countries is actually going down. Their currency has less value. They can't buy as much. So we're going to see exports from the US go down. Both of these things happening at the same time, we could think about what is that total effect on net exports? Well, if net exports are exports minus imports, imports go up, exports go down, net exports would be decreasing. So if we have a decrease in net exports, what's that going to do to our aggregate demand curve? It's going to decrease it, right? If we see a decrease in the aggregate demand, this goes back, like I said, we're reusing old concepts. This is even like module 7. We see that the new kind of short run GDP is actually lower. So we've caused what here? Well, if GDP is too low, we called that a recession or deflationary gap. The terminology I will specifically use on the exam is I will call these gaps when GDP is too low, recessionary. So that way we don't, there's technically kind of two terms I've used or that you can use. Here we're just going to use one, just to hopefully simplify it, right? GDP is too low, recession. Okay. So if that's the case, what should the government then do in terms of spending? So this goes back to like module 9. So we're kind of combining module 12 and 9 here. This might be one of the more, I would say, complicated or difficult questions on the final. So if we have GDP too low, what do we want to do? Well, the government actually wants to increase aggregate demand back to the original levels. We're not patient. We don't want to wait for the short run aggregate supply to adjust. We would have to do what? Well, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. In terms of fiscal policy or government spending, we would actually see that they would want what? Government spending to increase, hopefully getting our aggregate demand curve back to where it was before. taking a recessionary gap and closing it with hopefully no gap, right? Any questions on that before I kind of add one more thing in here? So, sorry, I should say two things. But if I increase government spending, what's another way through fiscal policy that the government can actually increase aggregate demand? Well, I can spend more, right? Or I could give individuals more money to spend, decreasing taxes, which would essentially increase my consumption, right? So I can either increase government spending or increase consumption through lowering taxes, in which case both of those would shift my aggregate demand to the right or increase it. Okay. Any questions here before I throw in one thing that'd probably be a little bit more difficult here, but this kind of ties into other concepts as well, where we're thinking about simultaneous shifts. Okay. So let's think about this same market that started out and we have a recessionary gap. So here was our long run aggregate supply. Here was our original aggregate demand curve. So we'll start out from a point where we just have, oh, no, I'm going to do it this way. I want to show you, I think this will help solidify this idea instead. So let's look at kind of real GDP. We've got aggregate demand. We've got long and short run aggregate supply. We said we start out with no gap. We then had that, to keep the colors consistent, we had that decrease in aggregate demand that was coming from changes in the exchange rate. Right? So without any other impacts, so this could be like a standalone question, which is just how did that change in US prices impact exchange rates? And then ultimately, what did that specifically do to our prices? Well, that took our price level and it decreased it. Okay. We then said, what would the response have to be in order for us to close this gap in between long and short run GDP? Well, we said it increased government spending or decreases in taxes. Now, the problem is if I don't know the relative size, so here, if I think about writing these two things down, so this is like the effect of prices going down, which drove up our exchange rate, right? Which then drove net exports down. If we wanted to compare that to the effect of either government spending or taxes, so here we kind of said, we can just focus on kind of government spending. Let's say government spending goes up by a little bit and only increases that aggregate demand to be right here. Well, if that's the case, what exists? Is it, if we have an inflationary gap, do we have a inflation or a recessionary gap? Well, in this case, I would still have GDP be too low. So if that effect of kind of that exchange rate changing is greater than the effect of government spending, we still end up with a recessionary gap, right? We haven't been able to close that gap completely. So let's say instead, what would have to be true if the government spending then led to these simultaneous changes? What if it led to an inflationary gap? Well, what would have to be true if we have an inflationary gap? Well, now our short run GDP would actually be greater than the long run GDP. So there, if I saw a very large change in government spending, that would actually push my new GDP to be higher. So the only way that I could see that is if that change from the effect of government spending was actually greater than the effect of changes in the international markets or increases in the exchange rate or net exports going down there. Okay? So I might give you a problem where I said we have these things happening simultaneously. In order for real GDP to increase, what would have to be true? And sorry, what would have to happen to how would the total effect be that the GDP has actually increased compared to old levels? We would need to have that effect of government spending actually be larger, right? Going from recession to an inflationary gap. Okay. So that's not in the question, but that would be something that's maybe a fourth part, I guess, of that question I could add in there. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So for me, that kind of wraps up everything from Module 12. I've got a set of questions I think could be helpful to work through or some topics, but I want to start out and give everybody an opportunity if you have specific questions over old practice problems or that kind of fifth quiz or quiz six, kind of you can ask those now. Okay. Could you explain more about the Laffer curve? So, yeah, so let's see. Quiz number 5. So, when it comes to the Laffer curve, I'll go through this quick because I may not focus as much on this if I was studying for the final. Wink, wink. But the concept is a good one to kind of think about when we're thinking about taxes, right? So when we have overall levels of taxes, and then we kind of think about the tax revenue that's generated from that, when taxes are low, right? Well, there large changes, large percentage changes in taxes, right? So if we think about like what's happening to the change in tax revenue, right? That's going to be equal to whatever the change in the taxes times that percentage change in the quantity that people are purchasing. Because total tax revenue is the number of units times whatever the tax per unit is. So going from like 0 to, I don't know, zero point 0.1 when tax rates are relatively low, that's going to be a pretty large percentage change in taxes. But initially, like if I'm not having to pay that much in taxes, I might not respond as much. I might keep buying about the same amount, right? So yes, I would see the quantity go down, but not by as large of a percent as that change in tax. So initially, right, that change in taxes is going to be relatively high. What is the percentage change in taxes? That's my slope of that Laffer curve. Okay. So as I start to increase taxes more and more, well, it's now going to be a larger portion of people's income. So now what happens? Now, even small percentage increases in the tax cause them to buy a lot less, causing that percentage change in tax to start to get lower, or we kind of said that slope is decreasing. Okay. Any questions there before we keep going? And then eventually, changes in taxes start to get to be a much lower percentage. Well, or sorry, yeah, get to be a lower percentage. So when tax rates start to get higher, now people buy a lot less. At some point, we'll start to see that increases in taxes because people are buying so much less of these goods. We actually see the change in tax revenue start to decrease, and it's decreasing at an increasing rate, kind of the opposite of when taxes were low. Okay. Now, any change in taxes here, what's tax revenue? Well, tax revenue is always above zero. So any tax that we set, we're always having positive tax revenue, right? It's just that is tax revenue increasing or decreasing? It starts to decrease when tax rates are relatively high because it causes that quantity to go down by a lot. Now, even at lower levels of taxes, as I increase the tax, yes, it might still be increasing tax revenue, but that increase coming from taxes is relatively now not as large compared to that reduction in the quantity people are buying. So that change in taxes starts to get lower and lower until eventually it starts to become negative. Okay. So there we're thinking about any change in taxes causes tax revenue to go up, but it's doing so at different rates. When tax rates are relatively low, the rate of change in tax revenue is going down. My slope is getting flatter. At higher levels of taxes, any further increase in taxes starts to decrease tax revenue and decreases it at an increasing rate. Okay. So the next one, people are so 5 and 8. Okay. So here, if we come down to 5, And I'll kind of read these if you want to kind of pull these open along with me instead of just switching back and forth. I think this might be more worthwhile. So I've got a decrease of investment in the physical capital, right? And then it's a greater change than the decrease in labor supply. And we're assuming no short run aggregate supply shift. What type of gap is going to be caused? What's the government response? And then what happens to long run prices? So here's where you could draw these out in the same graph. I'm going to draw them out separately. And I think for a lot of people, this will usually help because now when we're looking at simultaneous changes, the relative size of these changes matters. So let's say I've got my initial aggregate demand curve. I've got my initial supply. And here I would, throw in, I didn't tell you if there was a gap. So unless I tell you that you start out with a recession or inflationary gap, it's a safe assumption to assume there is no gap. And once again, I'll make sure I throw this phrase in to the questions in the final, which is assume potential and current GDP are the same. Right? But if you're not told, we assume that there's no gap initially. So what's the decrease in investment going to do, right? Well, if investment goes down, investment into physical capital, that was I. So we would see a decrease in aggregate demand. Here, there's always going to be three changes. So the first is in the short run, what happened to my GDP? It went down, right? So GDP in the short run from this investment decrease is going to go down. Now, long run GDP isn't impacted by aggregate demand shifts. It's still the same, right? We said over time, short run aggregate supply would kind of adjust and get us back to that long run level. So changes in aggregate demand cause no change in my long run GDP. Okay. So no change in my long run GDP. And then what happened to price levels? Here was my old price level in the short run, where short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand. Here's kind of my new like short run price. So this is also going to cause my prices to decrease, right, in the short run. Now, the other effect that we had going on here was if at the same time, let me make sure I can see Zoom so I can make sure that, there we go. So if at the same time, we're thinking about, we started out, we've got this aggregate demand, had our initial price level, and then initially GDP in the long run was the same as GDP in the short run. Okay. So if instead I had, what was this one? A labor supply decrease. Okay. So if I see a labor supply decrease, remember what shifts longer in aggregate supply? These factors of pull. So if I have a labor supply decrease, that's going to cause my new long run aggregate supply to go down. What are the impacts of that, right? Well, the impacts of that are going to be where is my new kind of long run GDP? It's now going to be lower. But where's the short run? Well, short run aggregate supply hasn't changed. In fact, that was given us to this in the problem. We assume, and all of these types of problems, I would always just tell you, assume the short run aggregate supply doesn't change. Well, there, my short run GDP is still the same. Okay. So if I think about this, what did we have? Labor supply decrease, that's going to cause no change in my short run GDP, but it's going to cause my long run GDP to go down. And then what's going to happen to price levels? Well, in the long run, my prices are going to increase, right? So one thing here we can think about is any impact on short run prices from aggregate demand shifts will eventually cause us to go to even lower prices. So if it's easier to think about, when you have aggregate demand shifts, long and short run prices change in the same direction. Okay, I should have done this in red, sorry. So then we can think about, okay, what's the total effect here? Well, it kind of depends, right? So they're pushing price in opposite directions. right? They're pushing, one of them's pushing short run, one of them's pushing long run GDP. And so if I know, so here, what were we told that oh, I want, there we go. So in question five, we were told, so we don't know if an inflation or deflationary gap exists because we have simultaneous changes in GDP. What do we know in terms of a recession or inflationary gap? We're comparing long and short run GDP. So if we had short run GDP going down, we also have kind of long run GDP going down. Well, if they went down by the same amount, we have no gap. But if we're told that there is, sorry, if we're told that the change in investments, right, has a greater impact than that decrease in supply, well, this is going to go down by a much larger amount than the long run GDP. If short run GDP falls by a larger amount, short run GDP is now going to be less than long run GDP. So if GDP in the short run is too low, we had a recessionary gap. Okay. And I'll draw this in on the same graph here, but I just want to pause here. Are there any questions on that before we keep moving? So trying to mimic this idea because we were told that that effect of the investment was larger. Here I've got that effect of the investment. What if I drew in that that long run aggregate supply decrease? Well, if it's relatively small, notice the short run GDP is still lower than my long run GDP, which is when we had a recessionary gap. If the reverse was true, well, then that reduction in the long run GDP is even greater than the reduction in short run GDP. There we would actually end up with an inflationary gap, right? It would just kind of everything works in the opposite direction. Okay. So that could be like a standalone question. What type of gap did this simultaneous change cause? Now, the follow-up questions here were if that occurs, so we have a recessionary gap, what should the government do to kind of close this gap, right? In terms of taxes. So we'll start out. We just determined there was a recessionary gap. So what would that look like? Well, that would have to mean that when we're looking at aggregate demand, we're looking at long run aggregate supply. If we have a recessionary gap, GDP in the long run is going to be greater than that GDP in the short run. Okay. So if we have this recessionary gap, what should the government do to close that? Well, if we want to get GDP to be higher, we need to use expansionary, right? Increase GDP, expand the economy, fiscal policy. So what is that going to do? It's going to increase our GDP. How do we do that? We need to change one of these factors. Now, specifically, if we're thinking about government spending, right, or government taxes, I could increase government spending, or we said, so that could be an option, but here we were specifically asked about taxes. How do I put more money out there in the economy for consumers to spend? I would decrease taxes. Okay. As I decrease taxes, that increases my aggregate demand curve until eventually I get back to that point where there is no gap. Now, what did the impact of that what was the impact of that change in taxes from the government? Well, relative to before, where were my long run prices, right? So I think you were specifically asked about long run prices. Initially, they were right here. After that government spending change, where does aggregate demand hit my long run aggregate supply? Oh, long run aggregate supply. Prices are now going to be higher. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving here? So if the pull impact is larger, there would be no, if the pull impact is larger, so let's say Sorry, I didn't see that question right away. Um, I have this drawn in here. Well, I can draw it out again. I'm going to draw this very quickly. So we have aggregate demand, we had long run aggregate supply, and we had initially what uh, decrease in aggregate demand. So now I'm forgetting exactly where we were at question wise. So we had what decrease in investment. So initially we had, let's say we had like a really small decrease in investment, right? And we had the original short run aggregate supply. That's going to decrease our GDP in the short run by a little bit, right? But if we also had a decrease in long run aggregate supply, which we were told we had this decrease in labor supply, which was one of the factors of pull, if it's very large, right? That long run aggregate supply change caused by the labor supply decrease is very large, right? Where would our new long run GDP be all the way down here? In which case now GDP is too high. We would actually have an inflationary gap caused by that. So what type of gap we have is dependent on which of those shifts was larger. If they're exactly the same, then we would have no gap, right? They're completely offsetting. Any other questions on that one? Okay, and the next question was number 8, and that was on the quiz, correct? So if we come down here to question 8, so let's say we start out and we have taxes going down, which would close a gap, right? So we're kind of starting out, we have this government decrease in income taxes, which causes us to get back to having no gap. However, this is kind of one of our cascading effect examples. If we see a decrease in income taxes, what's going to happen to our long run aggregate supply? So when we were connecting like that secondary effect, which is kind of uh, we said it could impact the aggregate supply because if I, what do I have here, an increase or decrease? So a decrease in taxes, whether or not that's on companies or consumers, all of those would mean that, okay, if there's fewer taxes out there, right, then people are able to kind of spend more money, right? If they're spending more money on other things, this could be investments into physical capital, investments into um, human capital, right? And if there's lower taxes, more people are likely to kind of want to work. So lower taxes could increase the labor supply, could increase investments into human capital or education, and then could increase investments into physical capital. It would kind of depend, right, if we had income taxes or if we had kind of business corporate taxes. So if that's the case, starting out from a point where we had no gap, right, that government spending kind of closed our gap. Okay, so price levels right here. So we kind of got to that first one. We would see a long run aggregate supply increase. Now, what did that long run aggregate supply increase do? Well, if I increase long run aggregate supply, and I'm thinking about what is happening to long run prices, where is my new long run price? Well, it's where aggregate demand hits my long run aggregate supply. So that should actually cause long run prices to decrease. Okay. Any questions on that? And then it's kind of a similar idea that we just worked through. What would have to be true if these simultaneous changes caused an inflationary gap? Right? So when we have government taxes decreasing, what did that do? Well, if government taxes decrease, right, then we're actually going to see an increase in aggregate demand. So what would that increase in aggregate demand do? Right? It's going to push GDP up, right? So we know that that aggregate demand increase should increase my short run GDP levels. Now, what did that long run aggregate supply do? Well, that also increased my long run GDP levels. So in order for me to have an inflationary gap, that means that the short run GDP has to be larger than my long run GDP. Okay. So if we kind of started out with no gap, it would have to be that this increase in the short run GDP is actually larger than the increase in long run GDP. That's the only way, if we started out and these were equal, sorry, these are equal, the only way short run GDP is now higher is if that change caused by taxes was actually greater than the change caused by that long run aggregate supply shift, whether or not that's through labor supply, education, or investments in the physical capital. So that's a pretty tough question, right? We've got simultaneous changes in both aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. And then it also ties in this secondary effect we said exists from taxes, which is that increases or decreases in taxes will change the behavior of either consumers or companies to increase one of those factors of pull, which then that secondary impact of the taxes was that it changed our long run aggregate supply. Any questions on that? It's a good one to ask. That's going to be one of like the tougher questions that you might see something similar to on the exam. In fact, it's literally one of the questions I had written down that if nobody asked that I wanted to work through. Yeah, so when it comes to these secondary effects, always assume that they're not existing unless I'm asking you specifically about questions about them. So, sorry, I'm trying to pull open the quiz so I can show you here, and Zoom is getting in my way. All right, so let's say I was looking at like question 8. I'm specifically asking you about that secondary effect because I'm asking you to tie that taxes to changes in long run aggregate supply, right? So I'll be very specific if I'm asking you about these secondary effects. That's the way that the question is going to be constructed, right? I will specifically ask you about what this change in taxes did to long run aggregate supply. That is the secondary effect. Okay. Now, in terms of what other effects could exist in terms of secondary effects, so here, our kind of first secondary effect would be that changes in taxes cause changes in one of these factors of pull, which would then change our long run aggregate supply, right? And then we could think about there, if I increase taxes, right, I decrease one of the factors of pull. If we decrease taxes, I'm increasing one of those factors, okay? Now, an additional secondary effect that we talked about, and this actually comes through our international market, we just looked more specifically at the steps of how that is going to cause the secondary effect, was let's say that we had something starting out in equilibrium, no gap, we were right here, okay? If we see an increase in government spending, right? We said that that's going to have a secondary effect. So if I increase government spending, that increases my aggregate demand, right? Which would cause kind of this real GDP in the short run to increase, right? And here was kind of our initial long run GDP. So on its own, changes in government spending would cause what? An inflationary gap, right? That would be more of an easier question that you could see on the exam. What did it also do to prices? It raised prices, right? So it increased my short run GDP and it increased my overall price levels, right? Going from kind of here to here. Now, what would the secondary effect be of this government spending, right? So when we're thinking about the additional secondary effect, it would be that if we see increases in government spending or we see decreases in taxes, Well, increases in government spending, and this would be more likely the example I give you. That means that the government has fewer available funds to loan out, right? So we said the other secondary effect is going to operate through our loanable funds market. So here we had kind of a real interest rates. So we've got the supply of money. Oh, sorry. Um, yeah, so sorry, the supply of, not money, supply of loanable funds. We've got the demand for loanable funds, right? If the government, um, what do I want here? So if we've got, oh, I got a question in the chat before we keep moving. Taxes trigger a second. Okay, that was the question I had earlier. Sorry. Um, so if we have government spending actually, what did we have here? Increase, right? That means that they have fewer kind of available funds um, to then supply to the market. So we should see, oh, no, sorry. We have fewer available funds. So we've got a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. The government can't loan out as much as before. So what did that do? That caused real interest rates to go up, right? If interest rates increase, here when we're thinking about what is the impact on investments into physical capital. Well, this is a little bit different than we talked about the international market because we're not thinking about how it's influencing foreign firms and foreign companies' investments. We're thinking about domestically when these companies want to take money out to invest in the physical capital, it's now going to be more costly to take out those loans, right? So loans become more costly. So what's going to happen? Investment in the physical capital, we're not going to take out as many loans. We have less, right, or kind of a lower amount of investments into physical capital. What would that do up here? Well, one of the factors of aggregate demand was investments into physical capital. So if those decrease, we could actually see that that aggregate demand goes down and it pushes short run GDP to be a little bit lower. So this was the idea of the crowding out effect, right? So that other secondary effect that we had, I guess here I should label it kind of two, was that if we have increases in government spending, that's actually going to cause our that secondary effect on short run GDP to be a little bit lower than it was before. And then the opposite is true. And it would still kind of work the same way. If we have lower taxes, people don't want to save as much money because they don't need to pay off these taxes. And so there we would see the supply of loanable funds also decrease and then have kind of that same impact on investments into physical capital. So changes in government spending or taxes, once again, both of these secondary effects could happen at the same time. I won't give you something that far. I will hone in or specifically just ask you about one of those secondary effects at a time. Does that hopefully answer the question there? And that was question 8, right? So I think I added one more thing in here, which was what? So we had taxes, result of this tax, we would see. Oh no, that was asking about, oh, that wasn't the question. That was a that was a question in the chat. Sorry. That wasn't the actual quiz question. That was a question in the chat. Yep. Okay. Any other questions on that idea of that secondary effect? And I think that would match up with if you just wanted to look at a question. Um, let me see where it would be. I think it's question. No, maybe I don't have one on the actual quiz here. So I have a labor supply. Um, yeah, so I don't have one that looks. Oh, question 7. Sorry, I was looking past it. Yep, question 7 would kind of line up with this example. Yeah, I would specifically kind of ask you about what the impacts kind of in those questions. For example, question 7, I say, what does this government spending do to real interest rates? Well, there we know we're talking about the secondary effect through the loanable funds market. In question 8, I ask you about what that change in government spending or taxes was on long run aggregate supply. So I'll kind of direct you towards what secondary effect we're looking at. Does that answer that question? I think it should. Okay. Any other questions that people want to see worked through here? Okay. Just want to check. Interest rate changes cause no shift in money demand. No, so here when we're thinking about changes in government spending or taxes, we're thinking about the loanable funds market, right? This isn't like the money supply market. You can think about it this way, like part of the money supply is how much money people are taking for, to put towards these loanable funds, but they're not one and the same, right? It's only a portion of the overall money supply. Okay. Any other questions people want to see? I got a couple in mind here. So just kind of doing some review, how much time we have left. I think it's worthwhile to kind of talk about monetary policy here. We primarily focus on the questions about uh, fiscal policy. So let's say I had an example instead, where Federal Reserve, and how do I want to construct this question to kind of help you? So let's say I told you that the Fed does something, and I could ask this in either direction, but I think maybe this way is a little bit harder. So I always want to kind of go through examples maybe that are a little more difficult here. So aggregate demand starts out here, and let's say we start out with a recessionary gap. So if that's the case, if I was drawing that out, a recessionary gap means that my GDP is currently too low, right? So that point where aggregate demand hits my aggregate supply curve, that's my short run GDP. We would always kind of get back to where that aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply. That's my long run GDP. So if I told you that there is this recessionary gap, what would the Fed have to do in order to close that gap? Right? So if we're thinking about how can the Fed influence things, it's doing that through what I was calling kind of that money market, right? And we're thinking about kind of exchange or interest rates, real interest rates. So we had some demand for money, right, from the domestic market. The Fed is essentially influencing this money supply, right? The total amount of US dollars kind of out there. So we started out, here was our kind of equilibrium interest rate. What does the Fed want to do? It wants to actually increase GDP. Well, if we want to increase GDP, so this is where I would kind of start out working backwards. We want to close that recessionary gap. What do we want to do? We want to increase something. What can the Fed influence? The investments into physical capital. So if the Fed wants to increase investments into physical capital, when will companies make those investments? When taking out loans is less costly. When are loans less costly? When interest rates are actually lower. So what should the Fed's response be in order to lower real interest rates? Well, they need to increase that money supply, which would push interest rates to be lower. So here a question could be basically, what is the Fed's response if a recessionary gap exists? Or anytime we work through one of these, you could always flip it, right? What if an inflationary gap exists? Everything would work in the exact opposite direction. But if a recessionary gap exists, how can I increase the money supply? The Fed really had two tools. Technically, they have four. I will tell you right now, I'm only going to use two of them on the exam. So the two that we will focus on specifically are we can buy or sell securities. So in this case, if I buy, oops, sorry, securities, I'm putting money out there into the banks. That's going to increase that money supply. The second thing we said they could do is if they decrease that required reserve ratio, the money that the Fed had, or sorry, that the banks have to loan out, they don't have to set as much of it aside. So they're loaning more of that out. They're going to increase the money supply. In fact, how do we determine the change in the money supply? It would be kind of our change in initial deposits, either from individuals or from the Fed, times 1 over our required reserve ratio, which is why decreasing that required reserve ratio increases this fraction and makes the same amount of initial deposits change that money supply by even more. By buying the securities, well, what was the Fed doing there? They were increasing the initial deposits. So even if the required reserve ratio stayed the same, that would also cause that increase in the money supply. So we could chase all of this down. I could ask you, what should the Fed do in terms of selling or buying securities or increasing or decreasing the required reserve ratio in response to an initial inflation or deflationary gap? And then I could ask you about things along the way, right? In order to, I could go reverse. If the Fed buys or sells securities, they buy securities, what happens to the real interest rate? It goes down. What happens to investments in the physical capital? They go up. What's happening to short run GDP? It's getting closer to that long run level, right? Or increases in investment, sorry, would increase our aggregate demand. Okay. Any questions on any of the steps there? So the monetary policy, I'll answer that in question in a second, is going to influence exchange rates in our economy, which then influence investments in the physical capital, which then impacts the economy overall, thinking about the overall real level of GDP and prices. So before I get to that chat question, there's one more thing I could ask you about here. And it's a little bit, it would be kind of a separate question in terms of like, not what is the effect or how does the Fed close recession or inflationary gaps, but it would be like if the Fed bought or sold securities, what happens to the overall price level in the US? So what's going to happen to the overall price level in the US? Well, initially it was here, right? And even if I'm not talking about short run prices, I could think about where would my long run prices have been before, where demand hit long run aggregate supply. If the Fed buys securities or decreases the required reserve ratio, what's going to happen? Well, the new point where this new aggregate demand curve hits long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply, it would actually increase both the prices in the long and short run. So I could ask you also, what does the action by the Fed do in terms of the overall price levels? It's kind of like two separate questions here, but since we already had things drawn out, I just thought I'd add that in. We could also be asked about what impacts does the Fed's actions have on price levels? Or what impacts does the Fed have on inflationary deflationary gaps? Or working backwards, if we have an inflation or recessionary gap, what would the Fed have to do to close it? And the chat said, so if interest rates increase or decrease, this is only impacting money demand. Yeah, so these are two separate things, right? When we're talking about real interest rates, right, that the Fed is setting, the supply and demand for money there is domestic, right? We're thinking about this isn't the supply or demand for the US dollar. This is just the overall amount of money that exists in the economy. Okay. So some of the US dollar will be held by foreign entities, some of it will be held by domestic. The total money supply here is we're not looking at that international market. This is the international plus the domestic market, if you want to think about it that way. So change in the money supply here by the Fed impacts kind of real interest rates. And then consequently, we're not thinking about how that impacts investments from foreign or countries. We're just thinking about how does that impact investments from domestic firms into these physical capital projects, which require them to take out loans. Okay. You think about it like when we had foreign demand, that is not going to influence the investments into physical capital by domestic firms. That's changing the investments of physical capital in other economies. Okay. So, the flow of this exam, just to kind of give you maybe some test taking things. So I know that there's a lot. We eventually have some of these models where we connect different ideas. It will have the same flow as class. We'll start out with kind of fiscal policy. We then will start out with monetary policy. I would then maybe have simultaneous shifts in fiscal and monetary policy, kind of combining those two together. Then looking at the international markets, and then the kind of final couple questions like we had in the quiz and that you'll see on the exam is how do changes in that international market that is setting exchange rates and the amount of the US dollar that's just available in international markets, right? Not kind of the overall level of the US dollar, then how would we kind of connect those exchange rates to some of this older material, fiscal or monetary policy?
Wait, so I have a question about that.
Mhm.
So you said it like follows the flow of class. So you'd say like in a row it'd be like question one through whatever would talk about the fiscal
Yeah,
or
if you
whatever, and
want,
then go on to the next topic.
yeah.
Okay,
And
cool.
so, if I don't know exactly off the top of my head without counting them, but it's probably going to be like 8 or 9 questions on, um, sorry, 8 or 9 questions on module 9, 8 or 9 questions on modules kind of 10 and 11, 8 or 9 questions on module 12, and then those remaining, 3 to 6 questions will be kind of combining those. Some of them are just combining fiscal and monetary policy. Some of them are connecting exchange rates to fiscal policy, exchange rates to monetary policy. I think I said both of those. Sorry. Exchange rates to fiscal, exchange rates to monetary. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And once again, if I'm asking you about secondary effects or I'm asking you to connect these, the question will direct you towards that, right? If it doesn't kind of give you kind of like a prompt to think about any of these secondary effects, it's going to be more simple questions, maybe where I'm just asking you about the effects of the Fed's actions. Then a more complicated question would be where I'm combining the Fed's actions back to like our long run aggregate supply model. Then I would have a question that looks like this. Okay. Any other problems or questions that people had? Okay, so what haven't we done? I've got some things written down. Um, okay, here's one that we haven't really touched on. Um, Two that I can think about. So one from module 9, one from module 11, 10, 11. So we'll do the module 11 one first since we were kind of talking about that just now. So one thing that we started off module 11 with was thinking about that changes in the money supply, sorry, were the initial deposits into the banks times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So I could give you some of the numeric problems on this exam would be something like this. So let's say scenario 1 that there's kind of new deposits into the bank from non-government entities, right? This is like individuals or firms kind of making investments into these banks or giving the banks money, right? When the banks have this initial money, they then kind of loan it back out. What is the total effect of loaning that money out on the money supply? Well, if it's originally a deposit from a non-government entity, that's not the total initial amount. So let's say I had like $20,000 in deposits. The initial amount that comes in, I have to set aside one over, or sorry, I have to set aside whatever that required reserve ratio is. So if the required reserve ratio here was 10%, that initial deposit of 20,000, how much am I left over with to loan out? So what this would be 10% would be 2,000. So I have that same 20,000 minus the amount that I had to set over, right? So technically here, if you wanted to be thinking about, you would take that 20,000, you would then subtract, you don't use the percentage here, we're using kind of the decimal form, right? How much of that 20,000 I have to set aside? This was 2,000, so the total amount that I have to loan back out from that initial deposit is 18,000. So if I want to think about what's the change in the money supply from an initial deposit of 20,000, I only have 18,000 left to loan out. The total effect of that would be 1 over that required reserve ratio. If it's 10%, once again, here we're not using the percentage form. Usually we are kind of given it in percentage form. This would be 0.1. So this is what? 1 over 0.1 is 10. So I'd have the total effect on the money supply of that initial $20,000 deposit. I can loan out 18,000 of that. Once I loan it out, I get more deposits back in, et cetera, et cetera. The total effect on the money supply would be whatever that leftover amount is I had to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. Okay. So another kind of question you see, okay, what's another way I could see this occur? So maybe I don't have a deposit from the non-government entity. Here I could see a deposit from the Fed. How would I get a deposit from the Fed? Well, they would buy these US securities, right? Give money to the banks. Well, when the Fed gives them money, that initial amount is not subject to that required reserve ratio. Right? So when we have a deposit from the Fed made into these banks, the changes in the money supply will be that initial investment, but the initial investment is not subject to that required reserve ratio. So here, if the Fed put in that same $20,000, they bought $20,000 of securities, the initial amount that they have to loan out isn't 18,000, it's that full 20,000. In which case, if the initial investment is higher from the Fed depositing that same amount of money, what's going to be true about the change in the money supply? It's going to be larger. In fact, if we use that same required reserve ratio, the total effect of that deposit from the Fed is actually going to be not 180,000, but 200,000. Okay? So knowing how to calculate that change in the money supply, wink, wink, I would maybe focus on this. But I would also think, if I had that same deposit made from the Fed from buying those US securities, would that effect be smaller or larger than if that deposit was made from a non-government entity? Okay. And then be careful when you're making these calculations, that is a decimal, right? 10% would be 0.1. Okay. Any questions on that? And then the only other thing I would add in here, what if the Fed sold bonds or securities? Well, if I sell bonds or securities, what's the total effect on my money supply? You would use that same equation, but if I sell securities, think about it this way, I'm taking money away from those banks. They have to buy these securities from me. So there you would still find the change in the money supply the same way, but the change in the money supply is now going to be that it decreases, not increases. Okay. Any questions on this? I've got one more I think we'll have time for unless there's specific questions that people had. So another type of question I might ask you is, let's assume we start out, and this is going back to like module 9. So let's say I have initially, here's my GDP in the long run. GDP in the short run is out here. So first of all, what type of gap would I have in this scenario? Well, usually this is something I'm going to tell you what the gap is, but I've drawn this out. GDP in the short run is higher than the long run level. I've got an inflationary gap. So if I tell you there's an inflationary gap, this is the visual depiction. If the government wants to close this gap by either doing what? Well, if they want to increase GDP, they need to either increase government spending or they need to decrease taxes. If they do that, right? Or sorry, I don't want to increase GDP here, right? I want to force it to be lower. We start out with an inflationary gap. So what can I do to do that? I can decrease government spending or I can increase taxes. So if I do that, I adjust, all right, or I shift that aggregate demand curve until short run GDP matches up with, excuse me, long run GDP. So if they do that, I'll, what I want to focus on first is I'll do here, but then I'll kind of connect this to another type of question I could ask. What's happening if I have an inflationary gap? Let's say I skip this step. I don't tell you, I don't ask you what the government should do. And I say, what's going to happen to the budget in response to this inflationary gap? Well, remember, the budget of the government is the taxes they receive minus government spending. And we didn't focus on these, but technically, transfer payments are in there. I won't ask you questions about that. Well, if I've decreased government spending, subtracting a smaller amount should increase my budget. Increasing taxes would also increase my budget. So if the government solves this inflationary gap, what are they doing? It's going to be more likely that the budget is now in a surplus. Okay. And then the reverse would be true if we have a recessionary gap, they would increase spending or decrease taxes, making it more likely they have a deficit. Okay. Now, follow-up question to this idea from Module 9 would be something, maybe I ask you about prices. So where would the long run prices initially be? Where that long run aggregate supply hit my aggregate demand. But after this decrease in government spending or increase in taxes, what have I done to the price levels in the economy? Well, the new aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply down here. So I would cause decreases in the long run price levels. Now, here's maybe a tricky question. Once again, I think I said this, I don't like that term, but something that might catch you off guard. What did this change in government spending or taxes do to my long run GDP? Well, my long run GDP was right here before. Any change in aggregate demand, we said earlier, does what to my long run GDP? Doesn't change it. It'll change the price levels, but aggregate demand at any point is hitting long run aggregate supply at the same level, right, of GDP. So changes in aggregate demand never change that long run aggregate supply, at least in terms of that initial effect. Okay. In fact, the changes in aggregate demand don't impact long run aggregate supply at all. It's just that some of the tools that we were using to change aggregate demand, we said then might have secondary effects. But in terms of just the shifts in aggregate demand, it's not going to have any secondary effects and it won't change our long run GDP. So changes in government spending, changes in taxes, in fact, even changes in monetary policy, none of them will impact long run GDP directly. Okay. Any questions on that before? So that takes us to the end of class here. Just as a reminder, so they've got that sixth quiz and that fifth Canvas discussion still open. Make sure you're getting those done as soon as possible so you can start studying for the final. If you have any issues with that extra credit quiz to add those points to the final, let me know as soon as possible so we can make sure that the honor lock system is specifically working for you and your devices prior to the final exam on Friday. And then I will post this video to the YouTube playlist. I have another section today. I'm sure we'll work through similar problems, but if people have additional problems, you can kind of go in. I'll upload that one as well. It might just be a more, an additional set of questions that we didn't cover today. It could be more material that you use to review. And then tomorrow, same kind of ideas today, other than we won't have like the first 15, 20 minutes of finishing module 12. I would think primarily today we did review of module 9 and 11, kind of 10 and 11 to kind of get combined. So tomorrow, maybe I would focus on some more of the questions that you see at the end of the practice problems or the quiz for module 12, and maybe focus a little bit more on those tomorrow. But if you have any questions, you can bring them tomorrow. Okay. So I'll stop the recording there.